The bandwidth for this episode of the AR-15 podcast is sponsored by the Firearms Radio Network. FirearmsRadio.tv.
Welcome to episode number 126 of the AR-15 podcast. I'm your host, Reed Snyder, and tonight I'm going to be flying solo. So this is the podcast about your favorite black rifle. This show is for you, whether you're building your first AR or you've been building ARs for years. There is something we can all do to take our black rifle to the next level. So thank you all for joining me tonight. I'm going to be covering part 4 in our series of building an AR from scratch. Of course, it's a little difficult communicating all of these things to you verbally, since we are not actually doing this in a video series yet. But let me assure you that with all of our attempts to do that, we are getting very good at our own videography. So we'll be trying to put together a video series of building an AR very soon. So until then, you'll just have to do with the best that I can muster together in terms of purely audio instruction. But before we get started with tonight's show, I want to remind you that it is Brownells that helps make this show possible. So don't forget that Brownells, with their 100% lifetime satisfaction guarantee, is there for you anytime you have a problem. And since we've all drummed to death the problems that we can have, I think I'm going to let this one go for a little while until we can figure out what our next one's going to be. But I do want to remind you that Brownell's Edge program is an awesome opportunity to really compound some savings on your shipping, on all of those items you might get and discover that they won't work, or that conceptually they're just not going to be a part of a good sound build for you. And with that return shipping being free, it really does take the bite out of making any mistakes on the internet. So I would definitely suggest the Edge program for anybody who's planning on building a new rifle, and really for anybody who is involved in firearms. It's a great opportunity. So we want to remind you that when you do shop for your AR-15 parts at Brownells, go to ar15podcast.com/parts, and in doing so, you will help this show be on the air just a little longer. So I think with that, we're going to go ahead and turn to our main topic. So tonight we're covering part 4 of building an AR-15 from scratch. So we're going to talk about building the upper receiver. In the first 2 episodes of this series, we talked about putting together the lower receiver. In the 3rd episode, we talked about the parts and some of the considerations that I think are becoming more and more second nature to prolific builders. But certainly these are the things that I would suggest that any builder take into consideration when getting ready to put together an upper receiver. So now let's talk about actually assembling all of those parts. So you've gotten all of your parts, and we start with our upper receiver. Now, if you buy a stripped upper receiver, you're going to have to do some additional work to the upper in order to make it compatible with your new rifle build. Those 2 typical aspects or components are going to be the forward assist and the ejection port cover. They are very straightforward assemblies and shouldn't give you too much trouble, although I will tell you that the forward assist assembly has the potential of creating another place on your rifle where, in drifting a roll pin into place, you might mar or scratch the surface. So when you put your forward assist together, you're going to have a forward assist spring, you're going to have a forward assist assembly, and then you're going to have a forward assist pin. You should have a hole that goes from top to bottom through the receiver, uh, through the opening through which the forward assist assembly is going to rest. And if you can start your forward assist pin, I would say from the bottom, simply because if you mar it, nobody's going to be able to really see the bottom all that much. But if you start it from the bottom of that hole, just so that it grabs enough of the receiver to just kind of stay in place, then you can put the forward assist assembly and the forward assist spring together and put it into that milled receptacle until it is depressed all the way in. So put as much pressure on it as you can. Now, when you're holding it with the one hand and you're trying to imagine how you're going to pound that pin in the rest of the way, I think you're going to see that this is, once again, one of those things that it would be nice to have, four hands, that not being all that realistic. It's also one of those things that you're not going to be able to get a whole lot of help if you're going to use a vice block. A vice block is the standard mechanism through which you're going to hold your upper receiver when mounting a barrel to it. But, once again, the vice block is going to pretty much obstruct the whole assembly that we're talking about here. So that's not really of any help. So the idea of putting your upper receiver on your bench, maybe getting a bath towel from your wife's collection of do not use hand towels, and just kind of fold it up so that it's going to cradle the upper receiver as you're holding on to it, maybe wedge it under your arm. I think you can see when you get to it how it's going to be possible to potentially use one hand to secure the receiver and another hand to drive a gunsmith's hammer or a small mallet of some sort. And I think you should be able to get it together. Now, when it comes to the ejection port cover, once again, this is one of those really simple assemblies. It consists of 4 parts. That's going to be your dust cover or your ejection port cover, an ejection port cover spring. You're going to have an ejection port cover pin, and then you're going to have an ejection hinge pin snap ring. So what I like to do on the ejection port, without a bolt or anything in the receiver, I lay the ejection port cover in place in its final locked resting place. And then I basically force the spring into the gap that's in the hinge component of that dust cover until it lies flat. And when you begin to look at it and look at a few images, you'll kind of get a sense of where that spring needs to be oriented. So you're going to be able to spring that dust cover down when it's ready to be, I guess, engaged or opened up. So as you press it in there and the dust cover, the ejection port cover, is holding the 2 arms of the spring in place, you're going to have an opportunity then to slide the dust cover pin, the ejection port cover pin, through the hinge milled components on your upper into the formed hinge space on the port cover and through the middle of the spring. And you'll follow that through to the other side of the port cover and the other milled hinge point. And once you get that pin seated all the way, your entire spring and port cover assembly is going to be locked in place. Now, the little snap ring that goes on the end of the ejection port cover pin is going to be on the end closest to the threads of your upper receiver. And so obviously if you have inserted the pin with that groove for the snap ring on the butt stock end of the upper receiver, it's in backwards. So reorient it, put it back in, and then you're going to put that snap ring in that groove that's in that pin. And the reason you do that is so that the pin doesn't drift rearward and potentially go out far enough or get displaced far enough to where your ejection port cover comes unhinged. So on the other side, the pin will never come out when you have a barrel nut, a handguard, or the delta ring assembly in place. All of those components will trap it in its position. So with that, you will have the bulk of a stripped upper receiver put together. So aspect of an upper receiver that I don't know that a lot of people consider all that much, and that is the face of the upper receiver, where your barrel is going to mate with the upper. There is a flat component, and the barrel extension is going to rest on that flat face of the upper receiver. There is a way to use a tool for lapping the receiver that will allow you to make sure that it is perfectly flush. It's called an upper receiver lapping tool. Brownell sells one. I've put a link in the show notes. And basically what they tell you to do is put a little bit of aluminum oxide lapping compound on that face. You attach this to a drill. It's designed in a way to allow for perfect concentricity. And with that lapping compound, you can ensure a more perfectly trued face on your upper receiver for mounting your barrel. Now keep in mind that that is probably, I would say, the only place on that rifle where variations in quality or components or manufacturing, milling, whatever the case may be, is going to directly impact the way a barrel mates to the receiver. Right on that leading edge of that threaded component on your upper. And so I've never done it. I have been close to pulling the trigger and getting a lapping tool. I've got a rifle that I think I am going to apply the process to. So as I do that, I will give you my feedback on it and let you know what I think of the result. So that is something that I think that really for a pretty modest amount, you can get to a place where you're providing yourself what could be a potential significant increase in accuracy. And, your mileage is going to vary. I can't say what that improvement is, but at $35, it's not like buying some of the other really cost-intensive tools that you might face in trying to build an upper receiver. So with that, I would definitely say it makes sense to go in there and try that if you really want to squeeze a little more out of your rifle. So I think after you've got that put together, the next important component of a build is going to be, in my opinion, putting the barrel in place. When you're going to attach the barrel to the receiver, I think one of the first things you want to make sure of is that you have a clean working surface. You want to know that your barrel extension and the receiver, where the two mate, are clean. There's no debris. There's nothing by way of fouling that's in those spaces, because I think that it's possible that anything in there that would obstruct the mating of the two, the barrel and the upper receiver, could potentially throw off what you're trying to put together. So clean it up well, make sure that it's clean, and you're essentially going to slip the barrel extension into the face of the upper receiver. And there is a pin on that barrel extension which basically secures the barrel extension to the barrel. The two are threaded, they are tightened up, and they're put in a press. And as they tighten it to the right torque, they put that pin top dead center, and that pin orients in a little groove in the face of the upper receiver at the very top. So when those two mate, you'll see that pin slide into that groove, and the lip of the barrel extension is going to seat firmly on the face of your upper receiver. When those two are attached, you're ready to put on a barrel nut. Now, I'll tell you that I've had a barrel and a receiver become really difficult to fit together. If you're going to use any kind of a lubricant, I would suggest a light machine oil. Some people like a heavier grease. My anxiety with a heavier grease is that you're going to have, some components of that grease application trapped in spaces. And as you apply the pressure, if there's no place for the parts to, squeeze out to, I think that you can create the deformations that you might see or the misalignments you might see if there were debris in that space. So I would go with the light machine oil. Of course, I'm sure that we have some much more experienced machinists who would have an opinion on whether or not that is even advisable at all. But I will tell you that when I've had too tight of a fit, I've had to basically get out a mallet to apply a little bit of direct force. Now, to avoid any marring, what I have come to discover is that just a short, 4 or 5 inch piece of 2x2, just regular pine lumber, laid on top of or across the receiver provides a really good absorber for the marring force of any kind of hammer. And the wood just kind of is not really strong enough to do any damage or deforming of the aluminum. So I've come to rely on that as my go-to mechanism for applying a little bit of a force when trying to seat the two together. And by the same token, if you're trying to drive an upper receiver off of a barrel, having a piece of lumber in front of the receiver as you're beating on it is another good way to prevent some marring. So I'm sure we all have a little piece of scrap lumber somewhere in our shops, but that's the way that I've seen it done, and that's the way that I've adopted. So when you have your barrel and your receiver essentially hand-mated, and there's nothing that's going to be keeping the two together, you're going to want to go ahead and grab your barrel nut. Your barrel nut is going to be, in most cases, with standard components, a very straightforward barrel nut. It's not special in any way. It is what is going to be attached to the delta ring and the weld ring and the snap ring for a standard set of drop-in handguards. But if you have a free float handguard or some other proprietary handguard, you're more than likely going to have to replace that standard barrel nut with whatever barrel nut your manufacturer provides. So there may or may not be a tool that is unique or specialized for what you've bought for a handguard. They all pretty much follow a standardized form or function. It's either a series of prongs that go into evenly spaced holes around the circumference of the barrel nut, or I guess the only way to describe it is the face of a sprocket and a wrench that goes over the sprocket to grab a hold. And it is through those two kind of typical ways of configuring a barrel nut that you're going to see your wrench mate to the device. And at that point, depending on what you have acquired as a tool, you're more than likely going to have, I think, a half inch drive opening like you would see in a ratchet driver, but it's going to be a place where you're going to attach a torque wrench. Now, my torque wrench isn't fancy. It's purely mechanical. Your torque on the handle is enough to move the scale, and when the scale gets to the appropriate torque, you know you've tightened it enough. So here is what I have come to understand is the conventional wisdom for torque. It's what I do for my rifles. It works for me, and I'm going to expand on it further when I'm done, but bear with me. So to begin with, I've understood that between 30 and 80 foot-pounds of torque is where you want your barrel nut to be. So I start on the low side and I torque it to 30. Then I back it off. I torque it to 30. I back it off. I mean, when I say back it off, completely untorque it, loosen it up to where I could hand remove the barrel nut if I needed to. So I do that twice. And then I torque it a third time to 30 pounds. Now, at this point, I've got a pretty wide range of torque that I can put on that barrel nut without getting out of the comfort zone that I have come to understand is there. What you need to understand is that when you apply your barrel nut and you get it torqued the way you want it to, I have never seen the gas tube, the gas hole in the upper receiver, and the gas block line up perfectly. They've always been just a little out of kilter. So what you now have to do is you have to continue to apply force and torque until your barrel nut orients to the next opening to create a clear path through the barrel nut to the gas hole on your upper receiver so your gas tube can cleanly go through that opening. Now, if your gas block, if your barrel nut, if any of those components are out of whack or off kilter, what can happen is your gas tube can be misaligned with your bolt carrier group. So as your bolt carrier group would come home to rest in battery, the gas key would basically interfere with the gas tube and it wouldn't seat. So you need your gas tube properly aligned. So there's a tool for that. It's a tool that Brownell sells, and really it's absolutely simple as simple can be. And what happens is this rod is slipped into the opening of your gas key. You put the bolt into your upper receiver and you basically try to seat it. If there are any obstructions, you'll be able to detect them. They'll interfere with the ability of that rod to slide through and have the bolt slide home. So as you're tightening up your barrel, in this phase of the assembly, you're going to have to take your upper receiver out of whatever you're using to hold it in place, be that a Geisley reaction rod, a Brownell's torquing rod. Magpul has their new receiver block, and of course the tried and true upper receiver blocks that you will find from Brownell's as well. Whatever it is, you're going to have to dismount that assembly from your whatever you're using to hold it in place, and you're going to have to put your bolt in there, your gas tube alignment tool, and try to slide it home. If it's not in place, you eyeball it, figure out where you are, what you need to do. And then, of course, you have to get everything mounted back up. You get your torque wrench and your barrel nut wrench in place, and you apply a little bit more force. Now, once you got everything lined up, you're good to go. You can leave that whole part of your assembly alone. And you shouldn't need to touch it again. I have never heard nor have I seen anybody talk about putting any kind of a thread lock on it. I don't know that you would want to. I don't know why you would want to. 30 foot-pounds of torque seems to be more than enough to grab a hold of that whole assembly and just keep it in place. Now, there are a lot of people that will say a lot of things about what you need to do to keep it in, to assemble that part of your upper receiver. Now, I've had friends, colleagues, people that I trust greatly talk about the customer service or the gunsmiths or the experts that they've talked to. And I've heard things like some of these people will hand tighten a barrel nut and then they'll put on a wrench and basically just line up your barrel nut to the next indexed component where you can slide your gas tube through. I've never done that. I've always gone above that so that I'm putting a full 30. Now, I've heard people say that you need to go up to 65 foot-pounds of torque or 85 foot-pounds of torque. I've heard people talk that the upper range is 130 foot-pounds of torque. You know, I just don't know how strong the threads in aluminum can be when mated to the threads in a steel barrel nut, and whether or not they would withstand the force that 130 foot-pounds would exert on them. I'm comfortable with 30. I'm comfortable with telling you 30, and I'm comfortable with every rifle I've ever shot that I've torqued to 30 foot-pounds. You know, I don't want to tell you that that's perfect or that's exactly right. So I do want to encourage you to find a gunsmith you trust, find out what their recommendation is, find out what source is going to tell you the thing that you are going to rely on. I don't want you to rely on me because I'm saying these words. I want you to use your own efforts to find a good understanding of where you think the torque ought to be. And here's why I think it's important for you to understand these issues of torque and putting together the rifle. For virtually every other component of the rifle, you are not expected to be in any way, shape, or form much in the way of a gunsmith. It is essentially putting things into place, seating pins, drifting pins, putting whatever connection mechanism is involved in the part in the place it needs to be, and you're done. And there's just not a whole lot being asked of you when you do that. Triggers, furniture, delta ring, muzzle devices, even gas tubes. There's not really a great deal to it. But I will tell you that there is a whole lot of thought that it is in the application of that torque, that it is in the way that those parts are mated, that it is in that space that you are going to affect the accuracy of the rifle. I've had people tell you if you over torque it, it'll never be accurate. I've had people tell you if you under torque it, then you're going to have other reliability issues. So I do think it's important to figure out where your comfort zone is and find out what you're going to adopt as the way you always assemble a build. For me, 30 foot-pounds, and then I go up until I have my barrel nut indexed to the next space for my gas tube. So there is one thing that I think is worth mentioning. Your threads on the upper receiver, your barrel nut, it's a pretty long span of threading, and my comfort level on this part basically makes me think I need to have an anti-seize compound or an anti-galling compound applied around the threads so that as I'm, tightening down my barrel nut, I'm not going to suffer the consequences of, any poor machining or any poor, cleanup, post machining, or anything that is just going to cause a problem with the threading of my barrel nut onto my receiver. And of course, this is an application of a different compound from, say, using some light machine oil on the surface of your barrel extension so that it, maneuvers freely into the upper receiver. So you're going to have an application of the anti-seize compound on the threads versus, for my comfort level, light machine oil on the flats of the inside of that upper receiver and the surface of your barrel extension. So I think that with those thoughts in your mind, you should be able to install a barrel to your upper receiver and essentially call the hardest part of the assembly of your rifle done with relative comfort and ease. I do think that it's important to have a torque wrench. And I've looked at a torque wrench and looked at the fancy ones, and they're expensive. They are more expensive than I have ever wanted to, I've never wanted to invest in one. Garage sales. Go to garage sales. You can find a torque wrench. Borrow your buddy's torque wrench. Whatever you can do to get a torque wrench, I suggest getting a torque wrench. I think it's an indispensable tool for assembling your rifle. All right. So that was a whole lot of extra verbiage on the barrel, but I do think it's important to make sure that you get that barrel installed properly. So next, let's talk about installing a gas block or a front sight base. So if you've ordered a barrel that's going to come in the kind of standard mil spec format, the M4 barrels, the A2 barrels, whatever form that is, if it's going to have an A2 style front sight base, that is likely to be pinned with taper pins to the barrel. So you do not have to worry about anything with regard to that front sight base. It's going to have a barrel nut already on there because once you get that thing pinned and attached, you can't slide a barrel nut onto the barrel. And on the end of that, you're going to have your snap ring, your weld spring, and your delta ring in place so that you can have your drop-in handguards secured. Right behind your front sight base is going to be a handguard cap. And so between the handguard cap and your delta ring, you're going to rest whatever handguard, drop-in handguard you've acquired into that area. So if you're not going to have a front sight base, or if you're going to pull off the delta ring and the provided barrel nut so that you can put a different kind of handguard on, you're going to have to drift those taper pins out. There are a lot of people that have a lot of ideas on how to do that. What it comes down to is an appropriate punch and some patience and the ability to secure the barrel in a way where you're applying your force directly onto the head of those pins instead of that force being essentially distributed across the barrel as it starts ringing like a dinner bell or a gong or something. So it's a little hard. You'll have to put a little thought into it. You can buy front sight base blocks that'll help you disassemble those parts. And for the most part, people don't ever have problems with taper pins. Of course, when we were preparing the build for the rifle we had, I had a problem with the taper pins. I took it to a gunsmith. The gunsmith had a problem with the taper pins. In fact, the gunsmith lost a couple of drill bits and snapped a couple of components in I think a 12-ton press trying to get the taper pins out. And he was not willing to go any further than that for fear that he was going to do some true damage. So sometimes it doesn't work. But for the most part, you should never have problems like that. Now, sometimes you don't buy the barrel with a set of taper pins and a front sight base. Sometimes you buy just a straight barrel with whatever profile it is, but it's never been tapped, it's never been drilled, it's never been prepped for the A2 style gas block. And if you're going to go with a low profile gas block or any other kind of gas block that doesn't have the front sight base, you're going to have to deal with a couple of other mounting issues. So there are basically two kinds of mounts that I've taken note of, and I'm sure there's one or two more that I haven't thought of or that I haven't seen, but certainly the two are basically a front sight or a gas block that has a series of screws, set screws on the bottom or on the side or in some orientation on it that you're expected to tighten down onto the barrel. Now, when you have that kind of front sight base or that kind of gas block, those set screws typically are designed to set in a dimple. And your barrel may or may not have dimples in it to receive the head of that set screw. There is a device that will allow you to drill dimples into your barrel. Now, of course, if your barrel has a surface treatment, there's every possibility that drilling into that surface treatment is going to allow you to basically breach that integrity on your barrel. Now, it is going to be underneath a gas block, but I've pulled gas blocks off of barrels and there's nothing but rust underneath. So how you're going to approach that issue is really a matter of your own preference. But if you can dimple the barrel, I think it's a much more comfortably secure mating of your gas block to your barrel. And I think the fear is that you're going to be carrying or driving or using your rifle in some way for that gas block to sharply hit a wall, a brick, a piece of steel. And if that gas block rotates on the barrel, then two things have just happened. Number one, your gas tube is no longer properly aligned for your bolt carrier group to come into battery and for the gas key on your bolt carrier group and the gas tube to mate properly. Number two, if your gas block has rotated, it is either constricting the gas port through the barrel, which means that you have some dynamics there at play that are going to be troubling or problematic, or it's rotated far enough to completely close it off, in which case you just turned your rifle into a single fire weapon. It is no longer semi-automatic. So I think that there is a fear that that might happen, which is why having a dimple and having those set screws rest in a dimple creates a more secure mating surface. Now, with a lot of handguards that we see in the market today, they're anticipating that the handguard is going to extend over top of the gas block. So the low profile gas block is obviously one designed to fit underneath a set of handguards or a handguard. And when they do, there's not a likelihood that you're going to have something strike your gas block and get it out of alignment. It's essentially protected by the handguard. So not as big an issue. Now, I'll tell you that on all of my gas blocks that are affixed with set screws, I use a little bit of blue Loctite after I've gotten them tightened down and lined up where I want them to be, so that they pretty much lock the threads. The other kind of gas block or front sight base that I have noticed in pretty large numbers are clamped varieties. That is, they don't provide a set screw that presses against the barrel itself to create the force or the pressure that will keep the item in place. What they basically do is they squeeze the gas block or the sight base around the circumference of the barrel so that just the direct force of that clamp is going to prevent it from rotating. Now, I don't know in practice whether or not this has ever been a problem for anybody. So I cannot give you an opinion about whether that's going to be an issue. I would be, once again, less concerned with something that's going to fit underneath a rail or a handguard because, once again, nothing can get to it. But if you're looking at a front sight base with maybe perhaps folding sights, we had to do an ARMS front sight base with folding sights for the build we gave away. Now, my concern would be that you extend the sights, you get the full deployment of that, gas block, and it seems to me that there's quite a few surfaces and quite enough leverage that can be applied to it that you can rotate it around the barrel where the device clamps to the barrel. So I don't know that happens. That's just, to me, a foreseeable anxiety, a foreseeable fear of the construction. But it's really, I guess, a matter of what your preference is, what's available, where you're going with your build, and what devices and what options are available to you. So either way, dimpled or clamped, I think that you're going to find a good solution. I just want you to think about what those are going to result in once you get your rifle built. At this point, you're going to install your gas tube. When you have your barrel nut in place, you get your gas block or your front sight put in place, you're going to install that gas tube. And so when it comes to the gas tube, I think you've got really a very few options. Of course, with a bunch of the pistol and shorter builds, you have gas tubes that are trying to fit the needs of those builders. And so I've seen gas tubes that basically curl around. They create a little curly cube, pig's tail. And what they're trying to do is put more distance, more travel in the tube and a shorter span down a shorter barrel so that they can, I guess, effectively control with length the recoil impulse that they're trying to impart to your bolt carrier group. I've seen just straight short pistol length gas tubes all the way to the full length rifle length gas tubes. I think when it comes to a gas tube, you're going to have to pick the gas tube that fits with the barrel's gas system that it's drilled for and the cartridge that you're designing your rifle around, and go from there. You've got some fancy coverings, but these are all things that are just going to come into play when you get down to the build and you get all your issues sorted and you troubleshoot and you're ready to install. So the only real thing that you have to worry about with the gas tube is making sure that it's aligned properly, which is fairly obvious when you get it put together. And then you want to make sure that you have your gas tube pinned to your gas block or your sight base. You're going to either use a short pin or a long pin, depending on what device you use. It should be clear in your instructions, your installation instructions, or with the device itself when you get it, which one you're looking for. Once again, like our starter punches that have an insert for the punch or for the pin, there is a starter punch for gas tube pins, and it's, I think, a good idea to invest in one. Really, that's probably the hardest pin of them all to install because it is, for the short ones, so thin, so short, and uh, so lacking in places to truly hold on to it. You're more likely to crush a thumb with a hammer than you are to get the thing pounded in. But as far as that pin goes, it really is never going to seat unless your gas block is oriented properly. A thin nail or brad that you can basically work into the space, which won't interfere with the function of the gas block or the function of the gas tube, to just line the holes up is going to probably save you more frustration than anything else in that build. And when you get that installed, you've got 3/4 of your rifle put together. So for the next couple of issues, these are just kind of some things to keep in mind when you're putting your rifle together, when you're assembling it. When I've got those parts put aside, you are at a place where you can really, finish off the upper in terms of being able to work on it in a workspace, locked up in a receiver block or whatever device you have after you get the muzzle device installed. So the muzzle device is simply just a function of screwing the device on a set of threads. However, you are going to have to put a washer in there and snug it up so that it's going to stay in place. Now, some of the muzzle devices have a very specific orientation. They're designed to specifically have things happen. The standard bird cage flash hider, many of them have a space along one side that doesn't have all of the slots or slits that the other sides do. And that's the side that will rest on the bottom of the barrel so that as you fire the rifle in a prone position, the expelled gases and burning gunpowder are not going to be forced out the bottom of that muzzle device and kick up dust into your face. And so it's important to understand that when you tighten that down, that space on the flash hider is on the bottom. And so to do that, we have a number of types of washers that we typically use to accomplish the goal. A crush washer is probably the most common. And so a crush washer is basically going to deform as you tighten up your muzzle device in the barrel. That's why they call it a crush washer. It gets crushed. A peel washer is a washer that appears to have many sheets of laminated metal that are pressed and presumably cut out of a larger sheet in such a way that it looks like your standard washer that you might see in a hardware store. However, you can peel layer by layer thin layers of metal off the off the peel washer. So what it's doing, or it's providing for you to be able to do, is change its thickness. So the thinner it gets, the more the muzzle device will rotate onto the barrel, allowing you to get it indexed into the right position. And finally, shims accomplish the same thing, but rather than like the peel washer, adjusting their thickness, what you may provide or be provided with is a package with many shims, and you just put the number of shims you need for your job in place. So between the three kinds of washers, and there are some other kinds of washers that you'll see, but I have typically not seen those kinds of washers called for unless it's a very specific and proprietary installation. But you're going to basically You're going to tighten down your muzzle device using whatever washer in the right, thickness or the right proportion, or whatever the case may be, depending on the washer. And then you're going to apply some force with your, basically your barrel wrench. That's going to have a space for tightening down that muzzle device until it indexes and orients on the barrel the way you need it to. And at that point, you're done. Now, I will tell you, in using shims, I have had to put a thread locker on a barrel so that that device stayed where it needed to be. And that's something that you should pay attention to, because it's happened before that muzzle devices have worked themselves loose with the forces that are being exerted on the barrel. So, but once that muzzle device is installed, there are no further reasons that you would typically need to, basically brace or support or hold your work in any of the armorer's blocks that you're going to find out there. So now we can turn to the last kind of three key components in installing or assembling your upper receiver. So, first, you need to put your charging handle in there. And this is on the receiver end. The charging handle has basically two kind of flared places on the end of the charging handle that are going to match up with mirrored but opposite openings in the upper receiver along the very top portion of it, where your top rail is going to be or your handguard is going to be. And you're going to want to basically get your charging handle lined up with those two lugs, seated in that cavity or space where the charging handle is going to ride, and you want to slide it home. Now, not all the way home. Don't lock it, because your gas key on your bolt carrier group is going to rest in the groove there, and that allows it to line up as it is slid into battery. I put a little bit of lubrication on the top of the charging handle just so that it slides in that groove a little more freely. When you get a bolt carrier group, by and large, they're ready to go into the rifle. When you pull it out of the packaging or whatever shipping material it's in, you should just be able to put it in your upper and be gone. I do suggest you lubricate it. I also suggest that you visually inspect your bolt carrier group. The bolt carrier group is the part of the rifle that I have seen break the most, and more specifically, the bolt. And so I think it bears mentioning that just looking at the bolt face, making sure there's nothing obvious by way of defect or deformation that causes you to think this just isn't right. So visual inspection is always an important part of that. Now, the last thing that I would tell you with regard to a bolt carrier group is that it can make sense to install an extractor upgrade kit. There's a little donut that basically fits around the outer portion of the spring under the extractor, and some of the upgrade kits have a little piece of rubber that fits inside the interior dimension of the spring under the extractor. Whichever kind you get, I do think it's worthwhile installing an upgrade kit on the extractor. You're going to have a much more forceful extraction, and I think a lot of people fear the possibility that you're not going to be able to pull the round out for whatever reason, or the spent cartridge out when you're going through your cycle. So I think the last piece is really to install your handguard. Once again, that's dependent on the kind of handguard you've acquired, and it's dependent on how that manufacturer has elected to go about whatever that made-up procedure is. So I would say that you just save that for last. And one of the big reasons I like to save it for last is because my handguard is the part that I put my furniture on or my accessories on. It's the place where I put my rail covers on. I want it to be nice. I don't want it to get marred up. because it was installed very quickly and it was in the way of everything I was doing on the rifle. So I tend to put it on last. I think that covers the fundamentals. I think that covers the basic components. And I think that covers some of the highlights that are worth mentioning when it comes to putting together an upper receiver. Obviously, I guarantee you I've forgotten something, and I guarantee you that we've got some great listeners who have some suggestions or input of their own that will also be helpful. So, please send that in and allow us to share it with the rest of the audience so that everybody can benefit by whatever thing or whatever knowledge you've come across that's going to help us all build a better rifle. But with that, I think we will move on in our series and wrap this main topic up for tonight. So next week, we will cover the tools and components that you will likely need or that will make building a rifle much simpler, as well as some of the final issues and the final checks that are worth performing to make sure that you have built a sound and safe rifle. So we'll be going over all of those in episode 5. And then I think in episode 6, we are going to cover a lot of the accessories that we know are out there and kind of talk about getting your rifle out to the range for the first time. So we'll have to cover some things like zeroing your rifle and just a number of the other basic things that have to be taken into consideration after you build a rifle so that you can shoot it and hit the side of a barn, like Anthony has been able to improve on since he's gotten his rifle. So with that, let's move on to our Otis Technology giveaway. And I want to let you know that I have no idea whose name this is or who it belongs to, but our winner for May 18th and the winner of an Otis rifle MSR cleaning kit is going to be at Spilicious. I don't really know if I pronounced that well, but it's at Spilicious. So it's in the show notes. We're sending them a notice that they've won. And by all means, we want you to get back with us to let us know what your address is, because that is always the most important part of winning a drawing. We need to know where to send the item to. So I think we are getting some really strong responses, quick responses from our winners, and we're getting our prizes sent out. But obviously, if you've heard your name, seen your name, or someone's told you your name was drawn and we don't have your address, it is unlikely that anything will ever show up. So do reach out to us. So with that, I just want to remind you guys that the fine folks at Otis Technology have sent over a mountain of rifle maintenance tools and cleaning kits for the AR-15 and AR-10. We've been tasked with giving them all away, and watch for the special posts on Facebook and Instagram to get your chance to win some of the awesome products made by Otis Technology. So we'll give away a complete MSR cleaning kit in either 556 or 762 in the middle of each month up until Christmas, when we'll give away a complete Otis Technology Elite cleaning system to one lucky listener. So during the alternating weeks, we will be giving away a host of Otis tools and cleaning supplies, to include Otis's new Star Chamber cleaning tool. So, guys, follow the breadcrumbs that Anthony puts up on the Facebook page to get out there and get yourself registered. And have no fear, for all of those guys like me who didn't grow up with computers and remember what it was to change the black and white television with a knob, we will have a simple U.S. Post Office snail mail approach to how you can get in on the drawing. So let's cover some feedback. So Miles wrote in and said it had been a long time since he'd sent in a message, and he sent us a picture of himself out of Cabela's. He says he wanted to thank us for our recent interviews with FN and Faxon. He's been curious about Faxon for a while. One of our listeners wrote in about an AR and 7.65 by 54. And he says he is afraid our listener's out of luck. He says the closest such match that he knows of are the Noreen. He calls them Bad News Rifles in 2006. So he says there's an awful pic of him in a beard holding a Noreen Bad News rifle that was chambered in 338 Lapua from a local Cabela's. He also put a link in there of what he calls a little number, which he thinks is only available in Europe, which I think really does us very little way of help. But certainly it does provide that listener an opportunity. I think his name was Jeremy, an opportunity to follow that up and see if there's something he could get his hands on. Miles, like we did, suggested providing yourself with a Russian variant of any of their prolific rifles chambered in that round is going to be about your best bet to get something out there. Chad wrote in, and he wanted to talk to us about the Clevis pen, which of course we mentioned in last week's show. So I think that is probably a pretty widespread hint or tip in putting together a lower receiver. So don't forget the Clevis pin. Rusty wanted to thank us and Brownells for sponsoring us and tells us he listens on Stitcher. He wanted to pass along the tip. He says go to the local sporting goods store and pick up a couple of hockey pucks. He says they're great on a workbench to put things on or put under things to protect parts and change the angles on things when you're working on them. Very much like a bench block that we would take a front sight base off with. So think about a hockey puck. That would be a good opportunity. If you drill a couple holes in it, you'll be able to easily drift things out of your assemblies into those holes, just like a front side block, or a bench block. Thanks, Rusty, for that tip. Let's see. Mark M wrote in, and this is Mark M, our post-production video guru, and he wrote in. He says he just listened to the full episode, and I would concur on the 6.5 Grendel show. He says he's almost done with his build. He has an 80% lower end process, AR Performance barrel, melanited, and it's chambered in the 6.5 Grendel /264 LBC. He says he got an Ares Armor bolt carrier, Timmy trigger, and he says there is a big debate about using the official 6.5 Grendel chamber versus the Grendel 2 or 264 LBC chamber. So, certainly I think that's another vote for a Grendel show, and, I think it might be very well time to come back to that. Joe wrote in with a couple of tips. He listened to episode 89 and put some links in his feedback for some truck bed storage options, which I looked at, and they're pretty interesting. Joe also wrote in a second time and said that he found something designed to go in your arm that shoots fire, that you might be able to figure out a way to get it on your AR. So he put a link in for a pyrotechnic device that can shoot fire from your wrist. So that's actually a pretty interesting device. I'd suggest following up on the link. Steve wrote in. He says, hey guys, as always, really enjoyed the show, especially the build portion you were doing currently. I have a two-part question. I work on building a 308 style target rifle, and I have been researching carbon fiber handguards and found one by Precision Reflex at Brownells. He wants to know if we have any experience with this company in reference to it holding up with a 308 caliber. Secondly, He's using an Armalite AR-10, and he wants to know really what is behind the whole concept of a free float rail. So, I responded back to Steve, and we talked about the free float rail issue. But I reminded him that we use the Precision Reflex Incorporated handguard for our rifle giveaway for the rifle we built, and the PRI handguard is just an awesome handguard. So I would definitely recommend it. I think it's got a whole lot of fans, and it's got a whole lot of traction in terms of people who are devoted to the particular handguard and the builds that use them. I would say next on the issue of what is it that we're talking about when we're talking about a free float rail. For those of you who do have a little bit of uncertainty, this is not like the idea of free floating a barrel for a hunting rifle. It's more like the idea of, I guess, a cantilever. So what we're talking about with a free float rail is a rail that, unlike your two-piece drop-in, is not going to be attached to the barrel by a handguard cap on the muzzle end and a delta ring on the receiver end of the barrel. The application of the force of those compressed springs and that drop-in handguard on those various components are exerting that force through the attachment into the barrel. So there's some deformation. Is it enough to rob you of the accuracy we expect of an AR? I would say no. Will it rob you of sub-MOA accuracy? Quite possibly. So we turn to the free float handguard to give you the ability to eliminate those points of contact. So rather than the handguard ever touching the barrel, the handguard only touches the barrel nut. And the barrel nut only ever touches a very small portion of the handguard, but not a portion that it can deform. There is no point at which the muzzle is shifted from a resting or interfered with place because of the application of a barrel nut. And because the handguard attaches to that barrel nut and at no other place touches the barrel, we consider it to float above the barrel. So it's free floating. And if you were to attach a sling with any of the sling mounts to the handguard and say sling up like the Marine Corps has taught Marines, or like Appleseed teaches their attendees, none of the forces of that sling applied to the handguard are going to be translated to the barrel, which means they're not going to move the point of impact on the rifle at all because of that slinging position, that slung position. So, free floating is a way that people try to get extra accuracy, and I hope that that kind of explains what we're looking at, what we're talking about when we say free float. So, obviously, if you have any questions, Steve, or if anybody else has any questions, send in some feedback, and we'll see if we can't get that answered more fully for you so that there's no confusion. So Larry C. wrote in, and he once again found the reference to the Clevis pin and suggests that we use that as an opportunity to install our pivot pin. So I think we've had 3 or 4 votes for that as an opportunity to put together your rifle. So Everett B. writes in and is telling us the good news about a build that he and his son put together, and talked about the really awesome opportunity he got from Palmetto to get a very reasonably built rifle with one of their Freedom Rifle kits. And, we're happy to see that he's found some good satisfaction with the Palmetto. And like we've said, we really are very happy with a lot of their components. He says that he's got a pre-assembled upper with a 16-inch stainless steel barrel, and it has a mid-length gas system. And he wants to know if there's anything specific to the stainless barrel that he should watch out for, or with the mid-length gas system. And he references the idea that most 16-inch barrels use a carbine length gas system and wants to know why mid-length. So I'll tell you, a lot of people and a lot of companies use the mid-length gas system because they want to tame the recoil impulse that is going to be delivered by a carbine system. So by making it a little longer, you're providing a recoil impulse that is going to be a little more muted and a little more comfortable to shoot. I don't know that amounts to much for many people, but once again, I'm not at a place where my tolerance for the recoil of rifles is so heightened that I would seek those kinds of changes. But obviously there are a lot of people that are attuned to that and are very cognizant of what those shifts do to their shooting. So I would say that you're fine, Everett, and what you have there is a rifle that's designed to be more inviting, more commercially viable for most any shooter. So you're fine with the mid-length. As far as the stainless steel barrel, I had a gunsmith tell me once that the stainless steel versus the chromoly vanadium steel that we see in a military spec barrel. The difference is that in that stainless steel, it's easier to cut. So when you're cutting the rifling, they're going to be more precise. But because it's easier to cut, it's also easier to wear out. So it's going to wear out faster. And I think that if you look at the precision barrels where, some very, very custom rifles are going to only be able to get 2, 3, 4, 5,000 rounds out before their ability to be accurate diminishes. It's because of the material being so easy to cut or burn out or whatever that makes them, fail. But I don't think that that's likely to be an issue with an AR. If you can put enough rounds in an AR to wear out the barrel, you probably don't have to worry about the cost of what it takes to replace the barrel. All things being equal and the cost of ammunition being what it is. If you can wear out a barrel, you have plenty of money to buy ammunition, which means that go get a new barrel, you'll be good. I would say that you're fine with the stainless barrel, and as long as you're kind of on the early side of its life expectancy, or the front side of its life expectancy, you're going to get some good accuracy out of it. So I say you're good. Go out, shoot your rifle, and enjoy it, Everett. So Jesse L wrote in, and he basically had another angle on the detent spring, and he gave us some pictures, and we put them up in the show notes. But here's the thing, and I don't know how many of you have noticed this, but in the well, in the well where you're going to put your detent spring and the detent, there on the side of that well is an opening, a little circular opening. And if you can use a small punch to depress the spring into the well, you can put a pin or a small nail or some piece of material into that hole, and it will retain that pin right where it sits. So his suggestion is to compress the spring, set a pin in that hole, remove your punch, and rest your pivot pin in the space left in that well. Now, with everything in its completely compressed and out of the way position, you can easily drop in your pivot pin. When your pivot pin is dropped in and it's covering that well so that the detent and the spring are trapped, you pull that little side pin out and it's going to release the spring. Everything goes back into its normal position, and you've just captured that whole assembly with what I think may very well be the least amount of fuss. So, yeah, that's an excellent, excellent observation, Jesse. Thanks for bringing that to our attention, and thanks for passing it on. So let's see. Tom G says, thanks for the refresher on building AR. Sorry, he forgot to tell you the lower is a sharp spikes. And I got to tell you, I think Tom G must have been part of some feedback from last week. So, Tom, you'll have to forgive me. It has been a busy week. But he wants to remind us that his lower was a Sharps Brothers designed Warthog, sold by Spikes, and it's on a 6.8 SPC build. He says it's at the job getting a Cerakote paint job in Texas Tan, and he's going to post some pics when he gets it back. So he'll be shooting iron sights until his scope becomes available. So he also tells us that he's got a Tegra carbon fiber lower that he's thinking of doing a build with and making it as light as possible to see how it does with the recoil. And so sometimes when you get too light, you get another set of problems, but he'd still like to try it out. All right. Well, that's great, Tom. Thanks for letting us know that. And we do want to see pictures. On Instagram, at JohnJohn_McLean, it says, great show series going on right now. I like the advice to consider all the options for the application. In my experience, high cost is not always directly related to performance. I think that is absolutely true. So that's a good pointer. Keep that in mind, guys. M. Ray 22925 shows us a pic of his rifle with what I believe is a can on it. And he says, range time with a subsonic 22. Thanks, M. Ray, for writing in. Let's see. At Life Behind a Gun, we have a picture of a Mark 12 Mod 0 build. Let's see. He says it's all done, and next on to the 300 Blackout. And he's got a PRI handguard, so anybody looking to get a view of one of those can come to the show notes and see that. And then let's see. It looks like at a Ledbetter gives us a sneak peek at his new build using a lightweight AR-15. Says it's almost done, and his goal is under 4.5 pounds. So, well, and he also wants it to be under budget. I don't know how I've ever been able to build anything in the AR world under budget. I just enjoy the stuff too much. But it looks like he has a Tegra lower. And I think that is the same carbon fiber lower that Tom G was mentioning. So certainly the polymer lowers were problematic in some of their original forms. And I think a lot of them had to be reinforced with metal, which really makes you wonder why you don't just start with aluminum. But if carbon fiber can get you to the same place with the reliability and consistency and materials technology that we need, more power to us. So, guys, those of you with carbon fiber lowers, let us know how they're stacking up, especially if you have some experience with polymer lowers. Well, I think, guys, with that, we've pretty much exhausted your host. And I don't know that I have anything more meaningful to impart to you today other than more of my usual BS. So I want to go ahead and sign off. Let you know that we do appreciate you listening to us. We appreciate you writing in, and we appreciate your participation, because really the only reason we're here is because of all of you guys, and because we all like ARs and we all want to get better at putting them together. So send us any questions or comments at feedback@ar15podcast.com. You can also send us a recorded voicemail by using the SpeakPipe plugin on the right-hand side of the AR-15 podcast website. Subscribe and listen to us on and podcast, or I'm sorry. Subscribe and listen to the podcast for free on iTunes or on Stitcher. And leave us a review so the show can be placed higher in the searches of other potential listeners. You can share our pics with us at AR15 Podcast, and you can tag your pictures with hashtag AR15 Podcast. Follow us on G+. To watch us live, you can check us out on our YouTube page. You can follow us on Facebook, and you can check out the other great podcasts on the Firearms Radio Network. Don't forget to use our Brownells affiliate link for all of your AR-15 parts. When you do, you help the show become financially solvent, which means we continue to provide you great content. Finally, when you go to Amazon, as we know we all do, to use our affiliate link, you will once again help the network provide a lot of really good content. So with that, I really appreciate everything you guys do to make this show great. And I appreciate the fact that you trust us with your time. And with that, we will see you next week. Good night.
This has been a production of the Firearms Radio Network. You can find more information at firearmsradio.tv.